Astralis. They're this top Danish team. They have been for a couple of years now with the core of what was formerly TSM. But that's something where people might vaguely know about this history, but they wouldn't have been around there from 1.6 when the team actually, the organization, a very different organization, was a Finnish organization back in the first half of the 2000s. So, okay, on January 18th of 2016, Astralis was formed in CSGO. So the Danish company, backed by Refresh and with some ownership of some of the shares by some of the players of the core that was formerly Dignitas, TSM. And then in the meantime, between leaving TSM and forming Astralis, they were called Team Question Mark, you might remember. Now, interestingly enough, Astralis as a name is a pretty cool name. And actually, I have to say, the way that Danes pronounce it actually sounds even cooler than when Finns say it, like Astralis. Like, that actually sounds pretty cool. But I actually think there was a missed opportunity in even picking that name, because when we were looking into, me and Richard and a few others were looking into the Refresh organization and if they owned some of these teams, primarily like Astralis, God Sent Heroic, teams like that, we will try and look as to which they owned and to what degree. When you look up the company information on the Danish public databases, it's quite cool that stuff's all available, you actually see that it seems like originally the company was registered as Spirit of Amiga and then became Astralis. Now, the reason that's interesting is because Spirit of Amiga is also a classic organization name from 1.6 and was a Danish organization. In fact, it was the first ever great Danish Counter-Strike team many moons ago. We're talking the beginning of the 2000s, the very beginning of Counter-Strike, and its first big tournaments, the CPL Europes, in 2000, 2001 in Europe. And they actually had, it only lasted a couple of years, and they had a team later on, but it wasn't as great. But they were the first truly great Danish organization. So I don't know if they just had concerns about if we use the term Amiga in the modern day, maybe the people who made the Amiga the computer, which is where the name came from, to pay homage to the classic computer, one of my favorites when I was a kid in the early 90s. I don't know if they were worried about copyright complaints there, and therefore they instead went and they bought this name Astralis. Obviously, it wouldn't cost them very much, from whoever had the ownership of that title in terms of the Finnish gaming organization. But the Finnish organization was very different. And in fact, it started as something of a lower level, almost grassroots type team without big names. So what happened was, in 2004, in April, the lineup was created from some members of a team previously called Identity Gaming Finland. And this squad was a player called Dewberry, who was one of the older members in the team. Wasn't a very good player, quite frankly. A player called Xavier, who was probably easily the most forgotten one of this particular squad. They had a player called Qvik, who didn't play tons of LANs, as you'll see when we get into it, mainly just in this one squad, but had some skill and is most famously featured in the classic CS Frag movie. Which one am I thinking of now? Ruination. There we go. He has that clip where they do the little circle to show you that he does a spray transfer onto a guy on Inferno at the A site. They had a player called Guardian, not to be confused with the player from Slovakia, who was better known to most of us as a Source player in later years. No one knew who this guy was at the time. This is a Finnish player. And at the time, they took in Digital, who was a well-known player already and had played in some top teams in the past from Finland, and even played in, I think at this point, he'd already played in a Swedish team called Experience Sweden with, I think, Karn and DSN. And he came in as a stand-in initially. And what happened was they made this lineup and they went to their first LAN only a few weeks later, which was a Finnish LAN called Tilt Games. Finland had a pretty vibrant LAN scene, actually. And the point of this LAN was not just to have a Finnish LAN and have the top teams there, but also the first place team would get the ESWC slot, Esports World Cup, which is one of the majors in Counter-Strike and a really big international tournament. They would get the slot to qualify and go to that tournament. Now, in the final of this tournament, Astralis played against Destination Skyline, which was Nartu's team. So Nartu obviously played in CSGO. He's a commentator now, but it was one of the legendary Finnish Counter-Strike players. And at this point in time, was still a strong individual player himself, one of the stars of the team, one of the better players, and an all-around type talent. So In fact, I'd compare him maybe to a Rain of that era. Like, not as good in terms of world Counter-Strike necessarily as Rain is now or has been for the last year, but that kind of an all-round talent. Now, Natu's team was expected to win this. They were considered to be the better team. Astralis shocked them. Astralis beat them in the final, and therefore Astralis got the ESWC slot, got to go to the big international tournament. Destination Skyline did not get to go. A few days later, because of this victory, and in fact this shows that Astralis was not considered the better team, Digital actually accepted an offer to go and play in Destination Skyline, who had better sponsorship, etc., with Natu and other top players. Tico, there's other players, Quali was a very good player. This was a time when this squad was considered to have the best players in Finland, was Destination Skyline. They themselves had removed a player called Melvin, who'd been a pretty good player but hadn't been quite as good on LAN, and that lineup itself went on to be very good, but we'll get to that in a minute. So the player they recruited to replace Digital, who'd only been a stand-in, was a player called Blood R. And this is a player who himself would get known for a particular clip at ESWC against Spixel, I think it was, or was it against Adrenaline? One of the two, it might have been Adrenaline, on Train. And actually had a couple of frag movies himself. His name, Blood R, was shot for Blood Rain. And a few months later, Xavier left, or was kicked, went inactive. You never quite know these scenarios. And he was replaced by a player called T-Hop, who at the time wasn't very well known, but would go on to become one of the more famous Finnish players and was primarily an AWPer. Now, at this point in time, it's worth pointing out, not only was this team semi-unknown until they got to this status, like they were vaguely known in the Finnish scene, no one knew them internationally, but they were actually a pretty young team. Like, Dubry was the older one, he was like 20. Most of the others were 17, were 18, so they were also a younger squad than Natu's team over there, who had like Natu and a bunch of the other players. Natu himself was already, well, much older than 17 or 18. So then you had another Finnish tournament. You had the World Cyber Games qualifier. Again, the World Cyber Games, a major, but that was one where it was kind of like WESG. You have to have players all from one country. And at this point in time, only one team from each country could represent that country, even though in latter years they let sometimes two or more compete. So the WCG Finnish qualifier was again going to be heated competition because obviously Destination Skyline wants to represent Finland there. Instead, Astralis, yet again on LAN, beat Destination Skyline in the final and took the slot. Now then, ESWC comes along. Oh, just to throw this detail in there. The reason why it's significant that Astralis beat D-Skyline in these Finnish tournaments and on LAN is because when Destination Skyline went to international tournaments, Destination Skyline was actually the better team and was the better performing team against the international competition. So, for example, at CPL Summer, a few months after this, maybe a month later, Destination Skyline finished 4th place, which was considered like you were 4th or 5th or top 6 or whatever in the world. They were a fantastic team. Meanwhile, they kept losing to Astralis back home. It was one of those matchup scenarios, one of those domestic matchups that tends to be troublesome. So then Astralis themselves go to their own international tournament. They go to ESWC. And in the group stage, they managed to beat out Spixel, this Swedish team that had the likes of Valle, who obviously went on to become a legendary player, Bullen, who was a very good player but tragically died a few years later. And Spixel themselves went on to finish second at this tournament in surprise fashion. They were actually a rising talent themselves. They, in the second group stage, because ESWC used to run a group stage into a single elimination round of 8-team bracket rather. In the second group stage, though, this team lost to Titan, who was the Danish team who actually went on to win the event and had a player, Wimp, who was a fantastic player. And the key game that denied them a chance to get to the playoffs was they lost in overtime to Adrenaline, the Swedish team, which famously was known to be Westerlund's team, but Westerlund had stepped back to a coaching or a management position at this point in time. But they had legendary Nordic player Executor. They had some very good, they had Lucchese, who was one of the best Swedish players. They had a very good team. And so even though they didn't do much themselves, it was no shame to lose to these teams. So basically they lost to Adrenaline, a bunch of veteran elite level players. They lost to Titan, eventual winners of the event, and they actually beat Spixel, who finished runners up. So, okay, it was a little underwhelming overall. Mainly, everyone just remembers that Blood R clip on Train. That was from another frag movie. I forget which one particularly. In fact, it was on a bunch of them. But overall, a decent enough placing for your first international tournament. The problem is, as you'd see, going forwards, they tended to, first of all, have the same problem, always run into the eventual winners and runners-up. And secondly, they tended to generally not do very well in terms of international placing, despite maintaining this dominance domestically. So back at home, in the Finnish eSport League, an online tournament, they beat D-Skyline again this time in the final. By the way, as a note, even though they were also good on LAN in Finland, they weren't as great internationally, Astralis is a very good online team. In fact, famously, people used to think of Finland as the onliners in terms of a country, contrasted with Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, who had fantastic LAN players and great legacy. Then you had, because they'd won the WCG qualifier, they also got to go to WCG. So off they go to World Cyber Games. And at the World Cyber Games, again, it's not a great placing. They finished 9th to 16th. They win their group easily. In the round of 16, the first round of the playoff bracket, unfortunately, they get drawn against Team 3D, so Moto, K-Sharp, Rambo, these legendary NA players, who at the time, admittedly, were in something of a slump in terms of form, and they lost to them, but in a 3-map series, and Team 3D did go on to win that World Cyber Games and the gold medal, so kind of an unlucky draw there in the first round of the playoffs, especially considering you won your group as well. There's also worth pointing out that this was a tournament that was held in Counter-Strike Condition 0, which essentially is 1.6, but reskinned. But the key difference was that grenade damage was very different. But anyway, losing to Team 3, winning a map, people still thought this was a decent performance, even though elsewhere internationally, D-Skyline was placing very highly, was doing very well. Now, because of D-Skyline being considered the better team internationally, I think having better sponsorship even, and having the more classic big name, marquee name players, D-Sky was able to take players from Astralis. So first of all, in October, so only a couple of weeks after WCG, they took T-Hop, the AWPer, and they put him into their squad to try and power up. Then you had a scenario where there was some player changes in Astralis. They took in a player called Acid. They brought in Melvin, who'd been kicked from D-Skyline earlier in the year, like 6 months earlier. Dubry, who was the worst player in the team, went inactive because he had to go and serve his Finnish army duty. And then the next month, Guardian left the team to go to join D-Skyline, and he was replaced by Alpha, who was the player kicked from D-Skyline, at least for the CPL at the end of the year. So CPL Winter comes along. You've already got the strong D-Skyline team that's been performing internationally, won a bunch of international lands, placed highly internationally. CPL Winter comes along, and Astralis does very poorly. Admittedly, with two of their best players gone. Arguably, Guardian and T-Hop were the best players in the team. They do very badly. They finish 17th to 24th. The teams they're losing to generally aren't good teams, except they lost to Big Rip, who had Khan and DSN and went on to finish 4th. But other than that, losing to Alternate Attacks at this point in time, not very good. They weren't a top team yet. So you come into the next year, you see the storylines maintained, good domestically, beating D-Skyline particularly, internationally, okay, decent, having some okay results, but never getting high placings. Now they've lost their players, but luckily for them, at the same event, Destination Skyline, who came in very hyped from practice, they were doing fantastically. I actually got to see some of their practices because I was living with Natu at the time. Everyone expected D-Sky to do very well. In fact, instead, I think they did a placing of something like 9th to 12th because they lost out to, I think, Death is Eternal, which was a team that surprised everyone. West Coast sort of semi-pug team, managed to finish top 8. And they also managed to lose to Complexity in an epic game on Nuke, when Bullseye had an amazing clutch, and this is what Complexity's run to 5th place and their redemption with Fraud and all those guys. And at the time, kind of turning themselves from a joke into a legit team. So because this failure had happened in Destination Skyline, there was a scenario where, I forget if they were kicked or if they left, but Guardian and T-Hop left the team and went back to join Astralis, where they also joined with a player called Nikusti, who'd been known from a team called Red Rom, and he was quite a decent player online. He was quite young from what I remember, had a pretty good deagle. Now, to make way for these players, Acid left, Alpha left. Alpha was more of like a supportive player, and Melvin left, again, just despite at one point in time having hype in like 2003, never really kind of lived up to that status. Now, funnily enough, despite losing some of their players, and obviously at one point in time seeming dead compared to D-Skyline, when they got Guardian and T-Hop back and they got online again, Finnish Esport League Season 2 final, they beat Destination Skyline again. At this point in time, I think Destination Skyline was already fucking around with a lineup that had legendary Finnish player Musa, who was an all-time great player, but mainly on LAN, and Natu's friend and former teammate. I think they had, I can't remember if they already had, what's his name? I actually forget his name, but he's a Swedish player who's in Gamers.net. I think they might have also had Snafe, a decent enough Swedish player at the time, but they were losing online to them. So because of going to WCG, they were allowed to go to a tournament called the Samsung European Championship. It was basically a European Championship version of the World Cyber Games. So if the World Cyber Games is the World Cup, or the Olympics, then Samsung European Championships is the European Championships or the European Championship of Football. Think of it that way. Now, at this tournament, the team actually had one of their first ever good placings on LAN. Okay, so they lost to SK Denmark, who was a brand new team at the time, and later on with some player changes would go on to come second at ESWC, but they beat a bunch of the lesser teams in the lower bracket, and in the lower bracket they eventually ran into SK Denmark again and lost to them here again. At this point in time, Kuvik, who was still around the lineup, went inactive, and actually Natu joined the team. Now, this is when Natu gave up on D-Skyline. Something had gone wrong. The new lineup hadn't worked very well. He gave up on, and he joined Astralis because he thought, right, maybe if I join these guys and I play in their team with them, again, I won't lose the domestic qualifiers and we'll get the international success because I'm a veteran. I can call to some degree. I'm clutch on LAN. I've got composure. So they go to their first international tournament with Natu, which was CPL Spain. It was in Barcelona. And it's a bad placing again, 9th to 12th. The only team they beat was Good Game, which is the French team. They lost to Complexity, who ended up finishing runners-up. And they lost to Catch Gamer of BSL, who currently works for ESL, funnily enough. And at the time, this wasn't the best Catch Game lineup, but it was an all right one. Back home, a few weeks later, in 2005 May, they have the ESWC qualifier. In the final, they beat in overtime a team called Marvel, and this was a notable team. At the time, some of the players weren't as well known, except Musa, but they had players like Conte and Ruit, two of the greatest players of all time. If you ever go and look at my article, I'll link it down there. I did a Fragbite of like top 10 Finnish players of all time. Absolutely fabulous players. They had a player called Tonpa, who would later go on to play in some of Lurpus's teams that had success. A week later, there was a tournament in Finland called Karelia, and at this tournament, they again played Marvel in the final. Again, it was a close match. They lost a map over the tournament. They won 2 maps against them, won this LAN as well. So at least this time, Natu's going to go to ESWC with them. Before that, though, we had the World Esports Games, WEG Season 2 tournament, which took place in South Korea, where you flew over to South Korea, you lived there for like a month. Each week you played matches in your group, went from one group stage to a second group stage to a top 4 single elim playoffs. And there weren't the best teams at this tournament. There was some like medium level European teams basically, but it was still a very interesting tournament format. Now, living together, having to practice together, some of the form and practice rooms for this team was fabulous. Again, I knew Natu, so I knew this. And early on, it looked good. In their group stage, they beat the German NTW. They beat A-Bit Strike, who was a Chinese team. Chinese teams hadn't yet risen to power, which they would at the end of the year. In the second group stage, though, okay, they beat Neo and Taz's Pentagram team, who was already decent at this point in time, but wasn't the Golden Five lineup of the next year. And also, I think this was the tournament where they had some issues in terms of rules. They lost to Begrip, who was the team who eventually won the tournament, was Forest, Roban, Tentpole. They lost heavily to them. They lost heavily to Catch Gamer again, who actually this time themselves became runners-up. So actually the curse there for Astralis is they often met teams who were runners-up or the winner in scenarios where losing to them eliminated you from the group. Again, big-time loss. Then you go to ESWC, which they'd qualified for. They are in a group, the first group stage, and this is one of those ones where sometimes the groups were huge. There were like 6 or 7 teams, but most of the teams were bombs. There were like a team from France and a team from Italy and a team from Macedonia. And some of these teams you were expected to easily beat, or Estonia, because they just weren't good teams, but it was international. Now, in this group, what really put them in a bad spot was they lost to SK Denmark, which was Zonic and Wimp, and that team eventually finished runners-up in the overall tournament. Oh, wait a second, I've got this in the wrong order. Go back a second. They lost to Advanced Online Losers from Germany. Now, that was an unacceptable loss, and that put them in a bad spot. But if they'd have won the last game of the group against SK Denmark, they would have qualified, and SK Denmark never could have gone on that run to the final. But they lost 16-14 on Train. In fact, actually, I think there might be a clip of that in the movie I made of Natu. I'm not sure, actually. And so they were eliminated in 17th to 24th place, despite actually being an all right team still. Back home, end of the month, they had the WCG qualifier, and you know what? Natu's gambit paid off in this sense, because he did win the WCG qualifier and got that WCG qualifier spot, but what do you know? He never got to play at that WCG qualifier with Astralis, because less than a month later, he left Astralis because of their problems on LAN, and he went over to join Four Kings, the UK squad, and get what at the time was a pretty good salary. I think at that time he already got like €1,000 a month, which by the way was the salary of like early NIP in CSGO, and was actually, the top salary by the end of 1.6 was about €1,700 a month. So actually pretty good money. I can see why he left. When he left, Ruit joined in his place. You had Inakuste went inactive. He was replaced by a player called Karmos, who's a decent enough player or seemed like a rising talent. This squad somewhat had petered out already. By the end of the year, they went to CPL Winter. Again, CPL Winter, one of the 2 CPL majors of the year. They only finished 70th to 24th. They maintained the history of this team failing on LAN. They lost to NIP, who had Zet and Nip and Potty and Heaton. They lost to 4 Kings of Natu in a close game in the lower bracket, and they went out pretty early in the tournament. Now, it's worth pointing out that this team also was famous for being one of those teams that kind of choked on LAN, and that was actually the feeling around players like Guardian specifically, because he was such a good player in Finland online, and to some degree T-Hawp, although T-Hawp had some LAN success later in his career, but he never was quite as good at AWPing as he was online or at Finnish qualifiers, quite frankly, in the international competition. So this was a team that is one of the classic examples of kind of a choking team on LAN. Now in 2006, Digital came in to replace Karmos because that just hadn't really worked out. They got themselves a Source team, which actually featured famed Finnish Source player Angel Dust. And despite having a Source team, the team that they sent to the Samsung European Championships, which was a CS Source event, because 2005 WCG had been, in fact, I probably should have looked that up, but I think actually maybe Natu did play with them at as a stand-in at the WCG, but they did really badly because it was held in Source. The qualifier was held in 1.6, but the WCG itself was held in Source. That was the one that was won by Team 3D over Adren from Gambit, who was like 17 or 16 or 15 or something, over Adren's K23 team in the final. And by the way, another player in that team, I believe, was actually, I think he already had player Beast, who was at one point in time the coach of Gambit a while ago in CSGO. So the Samsung European Championships, because it was held in Source, but it was the 1.6 teams, they sent the 1.6 lineup. They did pretty poorly here, finished 9th to 12th. At this point in time, Blood Argo's inactive. Another player I think had problems internationally. He's replaced by Conte, so we're seeing Rui, Conte, what would later be great players already starting to come into the lineup, players who've been in the team Marvel. And at this point in time, the lineup's actually a pretty fucking good lineup already. They've got Digital, veteran player, a lot of international experience. They've got Ruit, soon to become the best Finnish player. They've got T-Help, someone who has some international experience, good AWPer. They've got Guardian, one of the better Finnish players. And they've got Conte, who would emerge as one of the best Finnish players. Was a little bit of a baity player, but very good in clutch scenarios. Lurker type player, whereas Ruit was that aggressive, fur type player. Now you come to the ESWC qualifier, and okay, there's no Natu in Destination Skyline anymore. Natu's off in 4 Kings and not playing in Finnish qualifiers anymore. But what do you know? They win the SWC qualifier in the slot again. This time, they beat in the final a team called Serious Gaming. And who's in Serious Gaming? Again, some players who would go on to be in a better team this year than Astralis, but lost the domestic qualifier. So this was Lurpis, his brother Narsu, who's now currently the coach of, I think, Godsent, and was the coach of Penta recently in CSGO. And this was the makings of what later became Hurai, and it was from the Wing Squad, obviously, and eventually one day would become 69 and 28E and Rockat, etc., and accomplish some great things at one point in time, become the best team in the world. So they went to ESWC, but again, it was a poor placing. They finished 13th to 16th. In their group stage, they lost to NIP in close fashion, who was in a fabulous team at the time on Nuke. They beat the Ukrainian team, Amazing Gaming of like Blade and I think Starix at this point in time, but they had yet gone on to accomplish great things. In the next group stage, they lost to MIBR, who won the tournament. They lost to Fnatic, who finished runner-up at the tournament. Can you see the curse that again besets them when they're at these international lands? So after this tournament, Hurai, because again they were considered the better squad, were able to pick up Rui and Conte into their squad, and that's when they made one of their first really strong squads that had a bunch of top 4s for the rest of the year. So Astralis brings back Nikuste, brings back Bloodar, Musa replaces Digital, and they've gone back to something of an older lineup. But a few weeks later in July, the squad leaves to go to join H2K Gaming. People might know them now from the EU LCS, but back then they were a fairly unknown team. And I believe back then, I could be mistaken, I thought back then that they were a team from Netherlands. I don't know why I'm thinking that. It's either that or Sweden, so I could be incorrect there. But I think less than a month later, the squad left H2K Gaming again, and at this point in time, basically fractured, and you ended up with 2 different contingencies. You had the Hurai squad of Lopez and Narsu, but who had Ruit and Conte, and the Tompa guy I mentioned earlier, who went on to be very good, and you had a team called Team Anonymous, which was T-Hawp and Guardian from this squad, and then this is one of the first times we saw a player called Plaste, who went on to be very good in playing Lurpus' squads, and they had Spike One, who for some reason got famous just for like one demo and one movie, and people always said he was a good player on HLTV.org. He wasn't that good a player on LAN. And they had Shiri, who was the brother of Barak, who'd been in the Wing squad with Lurpus and Nasu earlier. Now, Astralis returned with a team only in 2009, so we're talking 3 years later. Otherwise, they dissipated out, and for good reason. They were one of those squads that had good players, had some good domestic performances, had some occasional good maps internationally, but never quite got it together. And it's one of those squads that was just something wrong with the atmosphere, wrong with that mix of players, and they just could never get over the hump, as it were, despite some of them going on to great things elsewhere in their careers. Now, in 2009, the reason Astralis returned was mainly just as a name. It wasn't really an organization, and it's because after some disputes in what was called Crack Clan at the time, Lurpus has already left to go when they'd kicked him. He'd already gone to Evil Geniuses. And so what was at the time the best Finnish team, which in 2007, 2008 had been some of the best teams we'd ever had from Finland. Fabulous international teams with some big placings, even some big international LAN wins. They'd broken apart. They'd lost the sponsorship. And so this Astralis team would formed where you had T-Hawp, one of the original members, Semi. I mean, he joined slightly after it had first been founded in 2004. And then you got a couple of players who played for them before, Conte, Ruiz. You had Plaste, who'd played with these guys in the Roccat 69N team. And you had Gigatus, who was something of an onliner, but kind of showing some form himself. And they had this decent squad. Now, T-Hawp left. A player called Vidi joined, and the problem is this team was expected to win the World Cyber Games qualifier and go to the World Cyber Games. But what happened was, at the World Cyber Games qualifier, Nasu, Lurpus' brother, who was playing in the team semi-inactive, I believe he'd be in the Finnish army even, and Natu was in the Crack Clan squad. At the qualifier, Nasu ended up turning up out of the blue. We should probably tell that anecdote on my new series at some point in time. Played fucking insane. They beat Crack Clan, and once they beat them and got the qualifier slot, then the team basically disbanded because since they had the spot to go to the WCG, Natu and Nasu's Crack Clan took in Rui and Conte, the best players from this particular lineup. And I think even eventually T-Hawp, although maybe that was just for the WEM tournament later on, because the team later became Power Gaming, and that team went on to become 9th to 16th at the WCG and really take very, very close. The team that won that tournament, which obviously, if you remember, World Cyber Games 2009, was obviously again the Polish team of Neo and Taz, but they played an amazing series against this team in the round of 16. So, okay, that broke the team up. That was the end of Astralis. So they had kind of a legacy. They had an interesting quality to them. There's no real connection between them and the Danish team now, but I thought I'd give you some history. There are a couple of movies I'll link, one there, of this team, both called the same name, which isn't helpful. Neither are particularly good, to be honest. The first one's at least decent. That was the one where it has like Lateralis as the intro music, and then it had that music which was a ridiculous rip-off of Tool and Lateralis. I think by like that guy, wasn't he called like Chris Vrienna or something, who'd worked with Nine Inch Nails at one point in time? I think he did it for Doom 3 or the Doom 3 trailer or something like that. I'm going from memory here. It's not that great a movie. And then the later movie, also not that great a movie, quite frankly. Sadly, a lot of 1.6 movies that feature HLTV footage can't be that good because of the fact HLTV was always laggy and looked like shit, to be honest. So, decent enough team, but certainly no all-time great squad. This video was made possible by Dean Tanglis, Sanity, Gman, Andreas, Snazore, Westerlund, Alex Adams, Mikkel Hansen, Jerky's Minion, Anthony, Bash, Daniel Yordanov, Yordan Tsenkov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Travis T. Greb. Just like my man, a lot of people think you can't tell me nothing, but I've graduated from that mindset. And now it is possible to have influence over some of the people I have on my shows, some of the topics I cover, to ask me questions directly and get exclusive teasers for upcoming projects I'm working on. Unlock the code to the streets and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link below.